Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a powerless podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 164, an overview of Tragic Cinema Part 2, Tragedies of Injustice. Alex, are you ready to talk about some more sad films?
Well, I'm feeling sad and I'm ready to talk about it.
But before we do that, I do want to mention that we have officially passed a huge milestone, Alex. Our second film today that we're talking about will be the 500th film that we have discussed formally on this show.
That's a lot of movies.
That's a lot of movies.
That's typically more, unless you're like a Letterboxd junkie, that's typically more than most people watch ever, like in their lifetime. Like most people maybe watch a few a year.
Or at least watch with enough attention on it that, like, you know, you could hold a 20-minute conversation about it.
Yeah, and I believe that, I mean, these are just the 500 that you and I have watched here for the podcast and discussed. But on our own time, and if you check our Letterboxd account, you'll see we're both well into the multiple thousands of films that have been watched. And, I mean... and you'll know this if you're on Letterboxd, but if you're curious, I don't think either of us mark down TV shows as having been films we watched on Letterboxd. One of my least favorite Letterboxd things they ever did on the platform was starting to include seasons of TV shows onto the platform.
But we digress. And to bring it back to the films that we're talking about, we're continuing our tragedy series. And as we started out last month, we are kind of going through some of the principles for tragedy, which, as we explained last time, tragedy being kind of a catch-all term for what we would consider drama these days, as opposed to comedy. And we went through the 6 different parts of what makes tragedy, what makes poetry. Alex, can you name them off the top of your head?
No. No, I can't do that.
Let's see. I'm actually not looking at it. Let's see if I can.
Can you do it? Yeah.
We have plot, character, thought, diction, spectacle, and melody. Oh, I did it. I got them. Okay. So yeah, those are the 6 elements that go into tragedy. And we talked about how plot is the primary element because plot reveals character in a way that thoughts and spectacle on their own cannot. So the plot being the culmination of all of the events that happen within the story. So to bring in a little bit more into this discussion, the ultimate aim of poetry in Aristotle's mind is the catharsis, which is the kind of refining of emotion and the kind of deriving of pleasure through the imitation of those emotions. So as Aristotle says, in the finest form of tragedy, the plot must imitate actions arousing pity and fear. So those are the 2 main things that Aristotle is going for when talking about tragedy, pity and fear. And he describes that as pity is occasioned by undeserved misfortune and fear by that of one like ourselves. So pity being someone who is being mistreated in a way that they don't deserve. Fear coming from if that person is someone just like, you know, that you can relate to in some way or other, then there's an amount of me. Yeah, there's an amount of fear that, you know, this could be me. Which Hitchcock was great at doing that. He made The Wrong Man film twice because that was one of the themes that played into a lot of his films. It's just this fear of being unjustly accused and going through this whole ordeal without...
And his personal neuroses.
Yeah, exactly. So Hitchcock was in tune with Aristotle on that point. But Aristotle kind of, in keeping that in mind, he lays out 3 different types of plots to avoid. And we're going to pick some holes in these because it's really interesting when you try to start applying these ideas to modern filmmaking. And we'll see if these hold up or not. But the first plot to avoid is a good man must not pass from happiness to misery. And Aristotle says that this is not fear-inspiring or piteous, it's just odious. And remember, when we're talking about good and bad men, we're talking about essentially their state of nobility. Like, if someone is completely good, upright, just, and they have every quality of nobility, and they go from happiness to misery, then we just get angry because, there's no reason for this. And this is going to be a big theme in the films that we're talking about today, as we're talking about tragedies of injustice. The second type of plot to avoid is a bad man must not pass from misery to happiness. This is not tragic. It doesn't appeal to pity or fear. It probably falls more in line with what comedy is ultimately, if a buffoon ends up kind of at the top by the end of the story. So that's to be avoided in tragedy. And the third type of plot to avoid is a very bad man must not pass from happiness to misery, which I think essentially the idea is, if this person is so terrible and they go from being in a very good position to falling to a very bad position, who cares? Like, that's what was supposed to happen anyway. So he says, there remains then the intermediate kind of personage, a man not preeminently virtuous and just, whose misfortune, however, is brought upon him not by vice and depravity, but by some error of judgment. And I think that's really interesting, because here we see someone who is not completely upright and noble. They have their flaws and stuff like that, but it's not necessarily their flaws or their kind of innate humanity that brings about their downfall, but it is some mistake that they made, like the tragic flaw, the fatal flaw, as it's kind of come to be known. That lapse in judgment is what is the catalyst for their ultimate downfall, or however the story ends up. And then there are other elements that we'll get into with some of the other episodes of, like, peripety and discovery, where the fortunes change and you learn new things that kind of go into changing that. But I think that these three types of plot to be avoided are going to be really applicable as we start talking about these films of injustice, power versus powerlessness, and stuff like that. So again, a good man not going from happiness to misery, a bad man must not go from misery to happiness, and a very bad man must not go from happiness to misery. We'll see how that plays out in the films that we're talking about today. But before we do that, Alex, what are the films that we're talking about today?
Well, first up, we have The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928, directed by the legendary silent film director Carl Theodor Dreyer, written by Joseph Dettel and Carl Dreyer, based on the actual record of the trial of Joan of Arc at the end of the 100 Years' War, starring René Jean Falconetti, Eugene Sylvian, Andre Berle, and Maurice Schutz. Cinematography by Rodolphe Matte, and music by Leo Pujo and Victor Alix. Next up, we have Umberto D from 1952, directed by Vittorio De Sica, written by Cesare Zavantini, loosely based on the life of De Sica's father, starring Carlo Battisti, Maria Pia Casillo, Lina Gennari, and cinematography by G.R. Aldo. Music by Alessandro Cicconini. Oh my gosh, it's so Italian. Killers of the Flower Moon from 2023 is our final film, directed by Martin Scorsese, written by Eric Roth and Martin Scorsese, based on the book of the same name by David Gran, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Lily Gladstone, Robert De Niro, cinematography by Rodrigo Prieto, and music by Robbie Robertson.
There you go. That's what we're getting into. So, Jason, let's start things off with The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928.
The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928. May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc is brought before a French clerical court on charges of heresy due to her public claim to have been given a mission from God to drive the English out of France during the 100 Years' War. What ensues is a struggle of power, morality, and spirituality as the politically motivated pro-English church leaders stoop to threats, deception, and intimidation in an attempt to get Joan to recant her divine calling, but are rebuffed at every turn by the steadfast conviction of their teenage captive. As history records, Joan is ultimately sentenced to death, but her spark lights a fire deep within the French people who rise up with renewed vigor against the English as the war continues.
All right, Jonathan, we've actually already watched this movie this year. Do you remember when we watched this movie this year, before now?
We watched a teeny tiny bit of it in Vivre sa vie.
Yes, we did, by Francois Truffaut. The movie about the tragic downfall of a
Godard
woman into, or was it Godard?
Yeah, that was Godard's like most normal film.
Yeah, which is saying something. It's still like broken up into very structured vignettes.
Yeah.
But yes, we watched it there. It was kind of talking about a woman of a less noble nature, but also experiencing a tragic downfall nonetheless, due to her own convictions, or perhaps lack thereof. Whereas in this movie, we're talking about the downfall of a woman due to her own convictions, and the need of the English judges to get her to capsize on those convictions in order to win a propaganda war.
Yeah. And I think that when we're talking about tragedy of injustice, I feel like the injustice of a innocent person being knowingly, wrongfully accused and convicted is about as unjust as it gets. It's like the essence of what injustice is.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point, because in some ways, we're just kind of, the way we're conveyed the sense of Joan's innocence is a key part of the filmmaking, right? We're revealed to it in just based on empathy through the way she's portrayed in all of her close-ups, and we're almost forced to sympathize with her in a way as an audience. But like the actual details of the case and the evidence presented don't really matter. It's more of like this very empathetic sense of innocence versus guilt, and the way that is conveyed to be a kangaroo court is all done through filmmaking, shot, reverse shot, and character reveals, rather than based on any knowledge of 11th century English theocratic law.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because really, you definitely get the sense that, under the terms of whatever the theocracy was, like, maybe she's guilty of heresy by saying that she had a vision of God to go fight the English or whatever. But
then you can't really prove it one way or the other.
Right. You still get the sense of like, well, regardless, is this the way to handle it? And also, there are so clearly political motivations behind it that it just doesn't even matter, because the whole point is she's going to get convicted no matter what. It really doesn't matter unless she like says whatever they want her to say. So through the process of that, it's like we go through the laundry list of interrogation. We go through the corruption, physical threats, deception, manipulation, gaslighting, like spiritual bullying when they like offer her the
sacrament. Yeah,
they offer her the sacrament and then they take it away.
We'll give you the sacrament.
Oh my gosh, it's just like one thing after another. They hit all of the things, and I think that it's great that Dreyer is able to kind of, because this trial took months to go about, and Dreyer compresses the entire procedure into basically one day. And so you kind of get, but you are still seeing that mental beatdown that Joan is going throughout the film, which is really the focus, which is why 99% of this film is shot in close-ups.
Yeah, which is crazy for the time. 1928 close-ups were not super common.
Yeah, there was very much I mean, this is a little bit early for any film rules, but a lot of the early film rules, like Hitchcock was a big proponent of cut to the wide. You know, whenever you don't know what to do, just pull back, don't focus in too specifically. But here, Dreyer is inventing what is really a very modern style of filmmaking, where you are right in there with the characters. You are getting that emotion like handed to you directly from the actors.
It's really taking advantage of the nature of cinema over theater.
Yeah, for sure. And again, the kind of shining light of the film being Maria Falconetti's performance, where she is all in, and you are able to take in every nuance of her misery. Again, we are bringing out that pity in the strongest way that you possibly can in this kind of a medium.
Yes, and we often talk about like what elements of a film are being focused on, and this one focuses on two. One being essentially the Kuleshov effect, shot reverse shot, and two being performance and directing. And this actress, Falconetti, this is her only cinematic role ever.
Not uncommon for 1928, I'm sure.
Not super uncommon. She was a stage actress, and she was convinced to do this one after Dreyer saw her in a production and really liked her, and she gave it her all. And it's a masterclass of silent acting. It is so good. The conflicting emotions and expressions on her face. They're always multi-layered. It's really, really, really good face acting. And if you're interested in acting or want to learn more or see more about acting, I gotta recommend this film. It's so persuasive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I love that Dreyer is like inventing new ways of doing cinema as you're watching through this film. And also, so part of the history of this film, which is a roller coaster in itself, I assume you watched this on Criterion?
Film Archive.
Oh, you didn't watch the Criterion one. Okay. So
I have watched the Criterion one like 5 years ago, but not recently.
Okay. I assume Film Archive has the same print that Criterion does, because there are so many different versions of this film that have come out throughout the years, because Dreyer shoots it and then it gets censored by the Catholic Church at the time, who, you know, of course, this film is very critical, and so it's cut down. I think the ending is cut down a lot. And Dreyer's upset about that. It was hailed when it came out, but it wasn't, I don't think it was very financially successful. But so then we have this censored version, and then it gets lost. I think it gets lost in a fire like twice, because that's what happened to old films all the time.
Film used to be ignitable, if you didn't know, or if you haven't watched Inglourious Bastards. Film pre like 1940, 1945 was prone to not just lighting on fire, but exploding, especially if it's stored improperly, and as it frequently was.
Especially if you stored it in a warehouse just full of nitrate film.
Yeah. And then they introduced safety film finally. Yeah.
So then it's lost. It gets pieced together by someone else who like adds a bunch of, they adapt the intertitles to have like stained glass in the background, and they add a bunch of fancy words, and they add a bunch of extra stuff to it. And so then that becomes, you know, the way to watch it for a while, because that's the only version that they had. And then finally, at some point in some hospital, I think, they find a print that was screened like before it was even censored, and it had been shown like one time and then put in a closet somewhere, and they find this print that's pretty much intact. But through all these different versions, the other thing is that from the version that was repieced together before that, they had taken a bunch of the extra film from the shooting and they used like alternate takes that were not the final takes from the film, but they still had the extra takes for some reason, which is actually kind of shocking. But because of that, because we have versions with old takes and stuff like that, we can see that Dreyer had a lot of other takes like wide shots and stuff like that, but chose not to use them. So it's not like an economy of filmmaking out of necessity, but out of choice for how he wanted to portray the story, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, he was very big on those close-ups. He shot them over and over and over. I don't think to Kubrick levels, but
that's why we had so many extra takes. Yeah. So that gave us a lot of extra takes to work with, but it also gives us an interesting behind-the-scenes look into his process a little bit. So yeah, that's a lot of the spectacle elements, but the story and the plot elements have a lot of really good stuff in there too, even though it is very contained. Not just the way that it's shot, but it's like all takes place in this one little Abbey courthouse or whatever, and then her little captivity room. So there is the one moment where she gets brought out to the stake to be burned first, the first time, and then she ends up signing the thing, and then she comes back to her room and they cut her hair, which is a really great symbolic moment because it's very reminiscent of like the story of Samson, who cuts his hair and loses his strength, and but then ultimately like regains his strength and is able to save the day, but at the cost of his own life. And that's kind of the moment that she has as she's watching the janitor sweep up her hair and her little wicker crown into the dustbin. And she's like, what did I just do? But I love this moment because it goes into another element of Aristotle's tragedy, which when we get to discovery and peripety, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's the reversal element. And so Aristotle says the worst situation is when the personage is with full knowledge on the point of doing the deed and leaves it undone. It is odious and also through the absence of suffering untragic. And Dreyer uses this technique. It's actually part of the actual story too, which is great. But dramatically, it's great because we have this moment where she goes to the stake. She has, committed herself this far, and then under her fatigue and her weariness, she ends up signing the paper and saves her life. And that is like the ultimate anti-cathartic moment because like Aristotle was saying, like she almost did it. She almost committed, and then she didn't, and she left it undone. And you have that absence of suffering. And so we have lost the pity. We've lost the fear. But then she changes her mind. She like has the basically a moment of discovery where she realizes what she did. And then she goes back. And that just amplifies the catharsis at the very end all the more. So I just really love that moment that they put in there.
Yeah, it's depending on how you look at it, it's either part of the hero's journey or an inversion of the hero's journey. Where at the 11th hour, she almost loses, or I guess if it's an inverse, she almost survives and then proceeds to discover the thing she needs to do to correct her path or to incorrect her path, depending on whether or not you look at the catharsis of her burning and her ascension to sainthood as a success or a failure. Depends on how you look at it, I guess.
Yeah, so that brings up another point that, thinking through these elements of plots to avoid. On first glance, I was thinking that this would fall into the category of a good man must not pass from happiness to misery. That's what it seems like. Joan is kind of the ultimate upstanding person, and then she passes into the misery of suffering and torture. But then I realized that that's actually not the case, because what it's ultimately about is Joan finding the joy in the basically the sacrifice of herself for her country, for her God, for, you know, for her conviction, because that's the whole thing. Like, again, she once she gets to that point, that is the ultimate win in her mind. And that's what, like, by the end, she is happy to go to the stake. And so it is her going from misery to happiness in a really strange kind of upside down way that I think is really brilliantly kind of shown through the film.
Yeah. I mean, if to understand a bit of like the historical context of Joan of Arc, not to get deep into it, but she was a military commander of sorts for the French, but she wasn't a super important strategic commander. She was a very important charismatic commander.
Yeah,
she was kind of
morale.
like right towards the end of the 100 Years' War when the French were almost lost, and almost lost everything. They didn't even have a king because Prince Charles couldn't be crowned and his father was dead or kidnapped. I can't remember which one. That happened multiple times over the course of the war, to multiple kings. But she kind of showed up to kind of become the symbol of the French and the French nation as like a chosen people of God of sorts, and they had God's support. And so by going through and becoming a martyr, she essentially fulfills that role of becoming a hero for the French, a martyr for the French, a rallying cry for the French.
Yeah. Who do go on to win the war.
Who do
Not
go on
too
to
long
win the
after
war.
that.
I mean, let's put it this way. Nobody really won that war, but the English were no longer in France. So there's that.
There you go. Yeah. But yeah, and that's kind of, they kind of get a encapsulation of that at the end of the film, which this is the first time I watched this film. It's been on my list for forever because it's always at the top of these,
it's at the top. Yeah. Especially
film
of like
lists.
silent film lists.
And so I was a little unprepared for how hard the ending goes because it goes way hard.
Oh, you weren't expecting a riot?
I wasn't expecting to watch the full immolation of Joan, and then the riots. So as Joan is burning, and we keep cutting between her and the people who realize someone shouts, "You've burned a saint," and then all the people rise up and they just start rioting, and the army comes out. They start dropping maces out the window and they're beating the townspeople. Even before the rioting starts, they're like prepared for this. And so there's this huge riot that happens as Joan is burning and her ashes are crumbling to the bottom of the stake. And then like the camera pans up to the smoke and says like the flames protected Joan's soul as she ascended into sainthood or whatever. And so it ends with this like, okay, Joan did what she needed to do, and now like the French people have the fire that they need to go on and win the war. I can't talk about this film without making that pun, okay? I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's to be expected.
But it's really effective the way this is done, and I totally understand why it has its place in every film list.
Yes, it is one of the early master classes in film and film technique. That was very much pushing boundaries for its time. It did very, very well. Like even the idea of like it's not uncommon to like put a hole in a set floor to get a shot. But this is one of the first movies to really make wide use of that, to get those low angle shots of Joan and the judges.
Well, to be clear, we have these shots from below the judges so that they're towering over the camera. Meanwhile, we're looking down at Joan. And so we're having that kind of hierarchy of scale, essentially, like in artistic terms of, looking down on the powerless and looking up at the power holders. As we kind of progressively reverse that dichotomy throughout the film.
Yeah. It is a really, really good silent film. I highly recommend you watch it. If you watch no other silent films, either watch this, any Charlie Chaplin movie, or Sunrise Song of Two Humans.
Yes. Yeah, and again, this film is like so influential out into the films that we've talked about before. So that's one of the goals with this series, is to hit some of these films that have been like waiting in the wings, that have been influencing all the other films we've been talking about. But yeah, this one is definitely a good one for that. Also, last thing to note, just kind of politically about the film, is that Carl Dreyer is not French, and that was a bit of a conundrum.
Really?
Dreyer
They weren't happy about that? Well, that does sound like something the French would not be happy about.
Yeah, so Dreyer is Danish, and so he was already, I don't know what films he had made before this, but he was already well respected. He would go on to make the his vampire film. There's something else that he's really well known for.
I believe he's well known for The Parson's Widow as well.
Yeah. Oh, and then he goes on like later into the sound era. I think he does Ordette and some other like really art housey films. But funny enough, as he's making this film, they're not too happy about it. I think they eventually kind of go along with him. But there's another French production of the film at about the same time, and no one remembers that film because it was not done as well as I think. As soon as Dreyer's film came out, it kind of became accepted as like the version of this story.
Oh, of Joan of Arc?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is I think this is the only modern representation of this story I can really think of, unless you count some video games. But even they don't focus on the trial; they focus on the campaigns before the trial.
Yeah. So as we're talking about these tragedies of injustice, there's kind of different ways that I feel like injustice can present itself. So this is, again, kind of the clearest version. This is the powerful, unjustly accusing and condemning a innocent person knowingly for like political power reasons. But there are other ways that injustice manifests itself through storytelling and through film. And the next one is a little bit harder to quantify and kind of put your finger on. So let's get into Umberto D. Jason, take it away.
Umberto D. from 1952. Umberto D. Ferrari is a retired government worker with too much debt to his landlady and not enough pension to cover his modest living expenses. After selling his watch and some books, he attempts to pay a portion of his debt, but his landlady will not accept anything but the full amount, and if he cannot pay by the end of the month, he will be evicted. Umberto's only two friends are his dog Flike and the housemaid Maria, who has problems of her own. After a short stay in the hospital for tonsillitis, Umberto learns that Flike has run away when the door was left open during renovation of his room. Now Umberto must both find his beloved dog and the motivation to continue scraping by when the little that he has is slipping through his grasp day by day.
All right, we have Vittorio De Sica back with us, which we haven't talked about too much. Italian neorealism, we talked about it way back in the World Tour. We mentioned it a lot during the French New Wave series, but Italian New Wave being kind of represented by the Bicycle Thieves, which is Vittorio De Sica's biggest film, probably his most popular or well-known film. But Umberto D is pretty close behind it, although neither of us had watched it before this. But really, the kind of running theme throughout, I think, all of Italian neorealism, which is this period of Italian film just post-war, actually bleeding into the war, if you're looking at things like Rossellini's what do they call that? What was the whole series called?
Rossellini's series? Are you talking about like Roma Città Aperta?
Yeah, isn't there a name for that?
Was there a series?
Trilogy?
I didn't know there was a sequel.
Yeah, it's Germany Year Zero, Rome Open City, and the other one. What do they call that series?
And the other one.
We talked about two of them. I don't remember what the last one's called.
It's the Neo-Realist trilogy, and it includes Roma Città Aperta, or Rome Open City, Germany Year Zero, and Paisan from 1946.
Paisan, that's the other one.
Which I believe we did watch for the show. way back when.
Yeah, we watched two of those. We did Rom Chita Aperta and we did Paisan at some point. But so yeah, those films, the point is those films start during the war. Like he was making those films before the war was even over in Italy. So this is a period from during the war to the post-year wars in Italy, and it's just the entire film movement is tragic because it's about this kind of war-torn Italy. It's about very personal stories of people struggling to get by throughout those years.
When we talk about the post-World War II economy in America, we talk about like this booming period of economics in the 50s and 60s. And that's true towards the later end of that era in Europe. But towards, I think sometimes, especially in America, it's hard to remember that the war happened in Europe. And so everything in Europe was more or less destroyed. So there's a long period, like a decade plus time, where everything is just crumbling, rampant inflation. There's no economy, no jobs. People are having a hard time. The best analogy to Americans would probably be the Great Depression, but amped up on steroids because it also includes the trauma of surviving and weathering all the destruction that comes with war.
Yeah. It's like the Great Depression, but also like 20% of the buildings have been bombed recently.
Yes. Yeah. You've lost a huge portion of your infrastructure. So even though nobody's fighting in the war anymore and you could go back to work, you can't. So yeah, it's not a good situation. It's just a hard situation for everyone to be in when the system's crumbled this bad, and it leaves a lot of people just completely falling through the cracks. And that's kind of the story of Umberto D.
Yeah. And so when I'm kind of trying to categorize this, I think of this as like injustice of marginalization in a sense, which I think is a type of injustice, but it's a really kind of slippery, non-tangible type of injustice. Would you categorize this differently, Alex?
I think it's very much an unintentional injustice. But it is, if anything, it's almost Kafkaesque in the sense that it's injustice derived from a failed bureaucracy. But oftentimes the bureaucracies in Kafkaesque stories are working as intended, and they're intended to be labyrinthine. This one just is failed. Like it's almost a failed state that Italy was at the end of World War II, and how terrible that is. So I don't know. It's like this desperate sense of powerlessness that's hard to categorize just because it's so unique compared to so many other things where we try to look for, like you were talking about, like good man, bad man. And this is the kind of injustice that catches you like regardless of whether or not you were a good man or a bad man. But we feel like we have to contextualize that because we're working in stories, and stories are used to give things meaning because we're humans. And so it's hard to categorize, and that's part of the tragedy, though, because we're looking for a reason for these things in Umberto D. But oftentimes there isn't a reason. Nobody really is acting cruelly. It's just things happen, and they're bad.
And it's going to kind of bleed into what we're going to talk about next month, which is Tragedy of Fate. And there are definitely elements of that here.
It's very close to that.
I think the difference here is that although we don't have like someone to point the finger at, like we have the Cardinals in Joan of Arc, and we're going to have some very specific characters that we can point at in Killers of the Flower Moon as committing the injustice. When I'm thinking about Umberto D, I think a lot about like the landlady, who's the closest thing to a villain that we have, although technically she doesn't do anything unjust. She is within her rights to kick him out for not paying his rent, etc., etc. It just feels like a kind of
she's not even being spiteful. She's just not paying attention.
She's supremely unsympathetic, which I think is the thing, is like the whole system, the whole world has become unsympathetic to the plight of people like Umberto D, which is kind of, so that's what I'm thinking of. Like there's not a technical injustice here, but there is a ultimate lack of like mercy or compassion that pervades the entire setting of this film, which feels more like injustice than the kind of tragedy of fate. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. It's like there are people who could help Umberto D and they just don't, because everyone has their own problems, or everyone's like, you know, essentially even Umberto has this sense of like, he should be able to pull himself up by his bootstraps. He just can't. Like, some of the saddest parts of the film are when he gets to the point where he has to go beg, but he can't bring himself to beg. And that's a fascinating element in itself, but it's, you know, it's just this sense that like, he won't even give himself a break, you know, to just like ask for help.
Yeah. Yeah. And even the times when he does ask for help, a lot of the people turn him down.
Yeah. Or he has to mask it. Like, he has to go to the hospital and, you know, pretend like there's a reason that he needs to stay a day in the hospital and actually get some decent food. But like the fact that, oh, my tonsils are hurting is kind of his best excuse to get help without asking for help.
Yeah. 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 It really dives down into a lot of like the shame affixed to that kind of situation. Even when Umberto didn't really do anything that to be ashamed of, there just wasn't anything. Like, the pension fund all vanished because of the just absolute destruction of the economy during and post World War II. He worked his whole life. He's too old and kind of sick to work now. He doesn't have anyone to support him. He's just totally on his own in a world that doesn't have a way to support someone like that. No system for it. And so he's kind of forced into these increasingly hard decisions. And then, of course, on top of that, he does have one being that loves him unconditionally. Flicka the dog.
Take it away, Alex. Take it away, Alex.
One of the best, or Filka that, I don't know how to say it.
Flyke.
Flyke?
I think they just call him Flyke.
Flyke, something like that. Whenever I read the subtitles, it just looked so much like Flicka to me, even though they were saying it. But yeah, he loves him unconditionally, will follow him anywhere. And Umberto's, at one point, towards the end of the film, Umberto is ready to just end it all. He's like, oh man, there's no point in hanging around here. Nothing I can gain anymore. No one I can help. I can't help myself. I'll just end myself, but I can't leave Flicka behind. So he tries to hold Flicka with him as he stands in front of a train. Flyke runs away. And after a tenuous makeup, they decide to run off into the park together. And it's left ambiguous. We don't know what the fate of Umberto D is. All we see is a perspective shift. So it from a pure tonal perspective, he winds up happy at the end, because he still has him and he still has his loyal dog, but we don't know what will become of them.
Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff about that ending. So specifically, since we just brought it up, like, I think of the the classic storytelling trope of the save the cat. Save the cat is one of the most like trite, hackneyed rules of storytelling, where if you want like to immediately establish sympathy with your protagonist, I think this was established by, there's a book called Save the Cat. I can't remember who wrote it. But you have your protagonist save a cat or some helpless something at the beginning of the film, and then we're automatically on the side of your protagonist. And I love that, like, this is taking Save the Cat and putting it in the very last act, and it essentially redeems Umberto. And essentially it's the cat saving him or the dog saving him, right? Instead of like he has to go save Flyke, Flyke saves himself and rescues Umberto in the process, which is kind of a really fun inversion of that trope. But yeah, I think when we're talking about Umberto, he is the ultimate intermediate man from what Aristotle was saying. Like, there remains the intermediate kind of person, a man not preeminently virtuous and just, whose misfortune is brought upon him not by vice or depravity, but an error of judgment. Which there's a lot of systemic things going on, of course, but I think that there is hints that this is also just slightly an error of judgment, in that at the very beginning, when he's petitioning for his pension with all the other pensioners, and then they get broken up by the police, and Umberto's like, man, I have so much debt to my landlady, I can't do I need my pension, right? Aren't you guys with me? And all the other guys are like, oh, actually, I don't have any debt, I just wanted a better pension. And like, no one else is in the same situation that he's in, so you have this sense that like he managed his finances poorly. He had some bad judgment there, but under other circumstances, he would be able to kind of work his way out of that element of poor judgment. But here he's like, he had a lapse in judgment in the way he handled his money, and now the world blew up and he has no way to get himself out of that hole at this point.
Yeah. I like that moment too, because it emphasizes how alone he is. Like that's one, I think that's maybe the biggest perspective shift that happens to Umberto over the course of the film, is almost every interaction ends with him alone, or either physically or verbally alone. Even if he interacts with another person, he's left alone. And at the very and that moment too, it's very much, oh well, we aren't really like you, so we're going to leave you alone now. And he's left alone yet again. But at the very end of the film is a moment when he realizes he's not really alone, and he has somebody. He has something to live for. Despite all the tragedy and the hardship and the injustice, he has a reason to continue.
And that's kind of the sense that you're left with is like that element of companionship is reason enough, essentially, for him. And I think that the elements of pity and fear are so interestingly played out throughout this. Because again, he's kind of just like any other guy. But again, that moment where he decides that he can't beg is such an interesting dichotomy, because we simultaneously want to say like, just beg, like that you have nothing else, just beg. But he literally chooses suicide over begging for money. And so even though we're like, well, you could just beg for money or food or whatever, the fact that he doesn't kind of gives us a sense that he still has his dignity about him. So it simultaneously is like, come on, like just do it. But we also feel better about him, or we like him more or pity him more, because we feel like he still is retaining some of that dignity. And then we go on to the train bit, and I feel like this is the second episode in a row where someone has almost jumped in front of a train. So maybe we need a new category of tragedy for 20th century man versus train.
Well, we've talked about the preeminence of trains in 20th century filmmaking before.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's Umberto D. Again, a very different kind of injustice, but I think it still kind of has a place, because it feels like just an unjust society, an unjust situation, even if that injustice can only be technically categorized as a lack of compassion. There's still something that feels unjust about that.
But that's a tragedy in and of itself, right? When all it would really take is like maybe one person to extend that compassion towards him, to be forgiving of his rent debt, or to offer him that one job with his old coworker, or his old, I think, army friend. I don't remember what they were, or something. Just one helping hand in that whole mess would have done a world of difference. And sometimes that's all it takes, and maybe that's part of the lesson too.
Yeah, I had this interesting sense when I was thinking through this, like that what we're watching is the parable of the Good Samaritan, but if the Good Samaritan wasn't there and you're just watching the guy be beat to a pulp on the side of the road and people just keep walking past him. That's kind of the sense that you get. Like, people just keep walking past him, and they could help. They don't have to help, but they could help, and they don't.
Yeah, and that's honestly like a really, really, really common kind of tragedy. Like, a lot of times when we talk about tragedy, like, we talk about like the big crazy things, or like we're about to talk about with the Killers of the Flower Moon, which is like an exceptionally evil, like, plot and stuff like that, or like a Passion of Joan of Arc, where it's high drama. But a lot of the everyday tragedies and the saddest ones and the most common ones are just somebody could help, but they don't, or they don't know how.
The tragedy of omission.
They're not able, or they didn't see that person, or something like that, or that person's too has enough dignity and doesn't want to ask for help. Like, we even saw, like, when he did have his hand out before he casually flipped it back over, somebody was going to stop and give him money. And then he flipped it back over. And I understand that from a personal perspective why he wouldn't do that. And I sympathize deeply with that point. But oh man, it's just, it hurts to watch.
Yeah. And before we move off of this too, I want to talk about the other, like, the tragedy B plot of Maria, the maid, which is a huge part of the film, even though it's not a very central part of the film, but it is a huge emotional driver of this movie.
It's a well-constructed B plot.
Yeah. So we have the
relevant and not overbearing.
Yeah. Well, pun intended?
Yes.
So we have the maid who's hired by the landlady at this kind of like house apartment thing. I'm not exactly sure how living arrangements work in Europe.
A lot of those used to be like single family homes that were converted into rooms, or they were tenements that were built intentionally to be apartments.
Yeah.
And a lot, that was really common, especially before you needed a lot of like specifically built indoor plumbing or specifically built gas lines or anything. Umberto's room is basically just like a room with a stove in the corner.
Yeah. And I will say there is a tangible element of injustice in the way that the landlady treats his room. Like, I don't know what the terms of his contract are, but I'm pretty sure she can't sublet his room while he's at work every day to people trying to hook up or, just like start tearing it apart at the drop of a hat. So there is some element of injustice in that. But then we have the maid who is pregnant. She has two lovers, though, and she doesn't know which one the child is, and neither of them are going to fess up to it. But what's great about that storyline is her whole thing is she's very just resigned to her fate. Like, she knows that once she starts showing, the landlady's going to kick her out and she's going to have no one to go to because none of her lovers are going to fess up or take responsibility for the baby. But she kind of just has this, silent resignation about it. But we have the one moment where she gets up in the morning, she goes in the kitchen and starts making the coffee, and she just starts crying. Like, but to herself, she just has like the most subtle tear falling down her face. And it is a really poignant, I think it's a completely silent scene because Italian neorealist films are not big on using music and stuff.
They couldn't afford it.
Yeah, but it's just this really beautiful character moment. Again, we just get to watch her performance as she walks around the kitchen. And it's a lot of building this tone. And again, this building the atmosphere of this is how the world, this is how society is right now. It's not just Umberto. It's so many people.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the thing you're inferring too from a lot of these Italian neorealist films.
Yeah,
is how just destroyed like the whole world is, and how tragic that is, which is appropriate because we're talking about tragedies.
Yep.
And I did want to say too, just before we move on, that my dog too, Suki, loves pine cones. If you pick them up and toss them, she will chase after them while they bounce around like a little maniac. It's one of her favorite things. She'll catch them, sit down, chew on them, throw them on her own, and then go get them again. So that moment really got me at the end of the movie.
Yeah, that was that it's such a short. There's like 2 minutes left in the film. Flyke runs away from the train, and Umberto goes back to him, and now Flyke backs away, and it's like he's almost lost. He's lost everything he's had piece by piece throughout the film, and now you're like, oh my gosh, now he lost Flyke. But Flyke comes back to him when he throws the pine cone, and it's just like, that is such a good moment of catharsis where you're just like, everything was almost gone, and then you can just kind of breathe a little bit. Like, he still has Flyke. Okay, it's gonna be okay. It's so well done.
Yeah, he still has something to live for at the end. He's got someone who cares about him.
Yeah.
And all he needs to be happy is a pine cone. And you know what? Umberto D can afford that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to a more modern kind of tragedy, or tragedy film anyway, in Killers of the Flower Moon. Jason, take it away.
Killers of the Flower Moon from 2023. After World War I, Ernest Burkhart goes to live with his brother Byron on the reservation ranch of their uncle William King Hale in the Osage region of Oklahoma. Hale is a friendly and well-known face within the Osage community, but he also resents the Osage for the oil wealth of their land and secretly employs Ernest and Byron to rob the people in various ways. At the same time, Ernest develops a romance with and eventually marries Molly Kyle, whose family owns oil head rights, although Molly is preceded by her mother and older sisters. In order for the Kyle's head rights to flow to the Burkhart family more quickly, Hale begins to coordinate a series of murders of the Osage people, sometimes subtly, sometimes less so. When a house bombing attracts the attention of the U.S. government, the nascent Bureau of Investigation is put on the case of the mysterious Osage murders. The federal investigation disrupts the town, putting to the test the loyalties of family, community, and nation.
All right, it's been a while since we talked about Martin Scorsese. He's still doing stuff. He is still doing stuff. He's still making epic, very long films.
Well, I mean, he never really made films that were that long. All of his old gangster movies are like right at or just over 2 hours. And so that's why I saw the runtime of this movie and I was like, oh, he's officially entered his old man movie making phase, which isn't necessary.
How long was Goodfellas? I thought that was pretty long.
Goodfellas is not that long.
It's 2.5 hours. Okay, yeah, that's pretty normal. But the Irishman was stupid.
Mean
long,
Streets
wasn't
is
it?
pretty quick. Casino's pretty quick. I think
The Irishman is 3.5 hours.
Yeah, I don't think The Departed's very long either. Which, by the way, did you ever get around to watching Infernal Affairs?
I haven't seen that or Departed, so
okay.
I'm waiting to sit down and watch them both.
That's a really good doubleheader. Infernal Affairs is so good. The Departed is also really good, but I feel like Infernal Affairs has a certain rawness to its setting that is more situated to the story being told than Boston or whatever it is it's Boston is in The Departed. That hot,
I almost put
sweaty,
Infernal
like,
Affairs
Indonesian summer
in this lineup, but I took it out for reasons I can't remember.
Yeah, I think the reasons might be something along my opinion for this movie, Jonathan, and that is that this is a very well-made movie. I think it's a very good movie, but I don't like it. I think it's very clear that this is made by like a master filmmaker, but I think like the focus of the story is just such an odd choice for the story, but it makes perfect sense for the director. And let me explain that what I'm saying. The setup.
Let's go, I think that's going to start. A lot of the conversation we're going to have for this.
Yeah, because who is Scorsese? He's the organized crime director. That's what he does, is organized crime.
You just made him sound like a crime boss himself. He directs organized crime.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he's good at. That's what he does. And so inadvertently, or maybe quite advertently, I don't know, this movie ends up taking on the flair of like a mob movie, where and honestly, the events of the movie play out in a way or are structured in a way. The plot is such of an organized crime, like it's all very intentional and morally bankrupt in how like gross the calculations are made and family oriented it is. And so I see how it ended up like that, especially with Scorsese at the helm. But I feel like the story being told didn't need that treatment. It could have used those elements, but not that treatment. And I think the fundamental error of this movie is the fact that Ernest is our main character. He is a terrible main character. Oh my gosh. He's such I'm not saying he's a bad character. He's just a bad main character for this story being told. He does have a certain change over the movie, and we'll get into that, like whether he's a good man, bad man. He's a bad man. And all those elements of it. But like this movie, I feel like had so much potential left in it because it didn't have the Osage as the main characters. It's so clearly about them and navigating this tragic world that's been enacted on them. The curse of natural resource wealth, which is, by the way, a well-studied economic phenomenon known as Dutch disease. Suddenly finding a bunch of material wealth, and then like how badly that typically screws over a nation or a group of people. It's like winning the lottery. Like almost nobody who wins the lottery keeps all that money. It almost always ends badly. And all the tragedy that's enacted upon them, either by that curse or the government or the parasitic people who move to their lands and kind of like take advantage of it being slightly outside the law on the frontier, kind of like a Deadwood type scenario. And it's just, oh man, that could have been such a good story. Why are we focusing on the criminal's point of view here? It would have been so good to have that revealed as like a mystery, to try to figure out, like, am I going crazy? Like, am I being gaslit here? Does this guy actually care for me? And those were the best parts of the movie, were the moments that focused on
That'd be very Hitchcockian, like a
Lily
suspicion
Gladstone's
kind of
character
story.
and her sisters. Like the moment where they're all talking speaking in Osage about the men around them, and they describe them like different kinds of animals and stuff, was phenomenal. And that's just such a good point of view. And I feel like to a certain extent, Scorsese was just a bad choice to direct this story. Like there's this really good old
Scorsese
clip.
didn't choose the story himself,
but it's of Denzel Washington talking about how certain stories that are of cultural relevance to certain peoples should really have a person from that background directing that movie or at the helm. Like you wouldn't have, like Spielberg makes sense to direct Shoah because of his background, right? So,
well, you mean Schindler's List.
Schindler's List. There you go. Yeah, not Shoah. Whew. Whew. But yeah, you wouldn't have a non-Jewish director direct Schindler's List. That would be weird. And I think we're seeing that here.
Well, that's the Dreyer conundrum too, though. Like, because Dreyer was not French, but he was kind of the best person to make that film in terms of quality of director at the time.
I guess the question there, though, is but he also wasn't English, I guess, is maybe what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, he was completely outside observer.
Yeah. And it was truly ancient history at that point. Like Joan of Arc was like 1431.
Yeah, the 1400s is a lot farther than like 1902 or whatever.
Lived from 1412 to 1431. Oh my God, I got it right. But yeah, that's truly ancient history, and a lot of that story is stripped of like its cultural nationalism in a sense. But yeah, I feel like this. I'm not, and I also want to say I don't think that Scorsese himself couldn't have done a better job directing this. But I feel like some of his choices that he made in directing it were just so classically Scorsese that it stripped a lot of like the interesting bits, the most interesting parts, the most sympathetic parts, the most empathetic parts out of the story, which is a bit of a shame. There's just so much crime caper in it that when I mean, it's in our tragedy episode for a reason. Like, this is a really deep, dark tragedy, and it's being treated kind of more like an entertaining story, which, and again, my other major nitpick, and the part I think is really bad, is the ending where we're hearing it all through the essentially the title credits, or the end credit scene where you see what happens to all the characters after the events of the story, is a live stage play, radio play event where everybody recounts what happens to the characters at the end of the story. And it's a true crime show. And it just kind of shows, like, again, like this tragedy kind of being used for entertainment purposes, which ostensibly all these tragedies are to a certain extent. But it just, again, shows kind of like a lack of level of empathy with the people at the center here. It if anything, like, there does seem to be a praising of the Osage, but almost to an over the top extent in some ways, where it's kind of othering them again to almost like a certain like stereotype of like the noble savage of a sorts. It's really weird. Some of the vibes are just off really bad in this movie. But that being said, all the film techniques are brilliant because Scorsese's a master at that, and he could do it in his sleep. But
that's the Warhorse effect. We talked about that when we looked at Spielberg's Warhorse, where it's just like the film is just almost too perfect. Like, it's so perfect, it's almost lacking personality.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There is a problem too. Like, when people get so good at filmmaking, there is a problem where they don't have somebody on their level to really give
look at
them
it objectively,
objective feedback. Yeah. And we've picked up bits of that story so many times, like when Bogdanovich dumps his wife and collaborator to run off with a starlet, and then his filmmaking career goes down the toilet. Or when George Lucas goes back to make the prequels for Star Wars, and nobody gives him any feedback because he's the superstar for making Star Wars. And so everything in the prequel trilogy of Star Wars is a first draft, and it shows. So like you need somebody to come down and like edit your stuff to give you feedback, critical feedback to improve your things. Nobody's going to get it right on the first draft, no matter how good you are. And again, just because I'm on a roll right now, old man movie disease, which is looking at you, Ridley Scott, every movie suddenly becomes 3 or 4 hours because everything you do is good. So you don't trim anything, when ostensibly there's always something to trim. Even regardless of how good it is, the bar goes up, sure, for what you trim, but does the story actually need to be 3.5 hours long? No, I don't think it does. But it is, and all of it is good, but that doesn't mean I like it.
Oh man, there's so many things to say. I love when Alex gets on a roll.
Scorsese, take some feedback, not from me necessarily, but find somebody to give you hard editorial feedback.
Okay. I have a note for you from Aristotle about story length, if I can find it.
If he doesn't agree with me, I will fight Aristotle.
Well, okay, so Aristotle's point, and again, he's talking about stage drama, obviously, but basically he says the plot has to be long enough to encompass one action. We talked about how plot should be the unfolding of a single event, ultimately. And so when that event starts, you start your film. When that event ends, you end the film. So it should be as long as it needs to be to complete the action. But also, remember, you've got people sitting in seats out there, and they only have so much attention span. And So there's
2 hours is right around the time that you should stand up if you've been sitting for that whole time. So that's a good capstone. That's where you see most movies fall. So, whew.
He does say, though, in terms of the epicness, the longer the better. So, as long as you can. Here, okay, I found it. Okay, ready? Just in the same way, then, as a beautiful whole made up of parts, or a beautiful living creature must be of some size, a size taken in by the eye, so a story or a plot must be of some length, but of a length to be taken in by the memory. As for the limit of its length, so far as that is relative to public performance and spectators, it does not fall within the theory of poetry. Whatever. If they had to perform 100 tragedies, they would be timed by water clocks, as they are said to have been at one period. The limit, however, is set by the actual nature of the thing, is the longer the story, consistent with its being comprehensible as a whole, the finer it is by reason of its magnitude. As a rough general formula, a length which allows of the hero passing by a series of probable or necessary stages from misfortune to happiness, or the reverse, may suffice as a limit for the magnitude of the story. So yeah, he's saying, basically, you've got people sitting there, but make it as long as you can, because that'll be epic.
Yeah, a story should be as long as it needs to be. It would be my opinion on the matter. And even if you have another scene, if you have, let's say you have 90 scenes, and you have an idea for a 91st scene, and that 91st scene is really good, but the story can still be told with the first 90 and be a good story, you don't need the 91st scene.
And that's another Aristotelian idea, which is anything that does not affect the whole has to go.
Yeah. If it's not necessary to tell the story, it shouldn't be in there. Yeah. And that doesn't mean necessarily just plot moments. Like there are a lot of good moments in this movie, and many other movies that don't seem to have a lot of plot in them. They're just really like character interactions or soft, quiet moments between characters that show their state of mind, or flesh out a different side of them, or give it a sense of setting. And if that's important to the story you're telling and the movie you're telling, then yeah, it should stay in there. But yeah, I feel like there's a good number of crime caper scenes in this movie alone that could have been cut, and nothing would have been affected in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. Okay. Now, to respond to your rant, I have a lot of things to bring up, which may or may not affect your opinion, but will hopefully, at the very least, give you some clarity on some of these points. Do you know what the point of the book was? Do you know what the main kind of idea of the book is?
I know nothing about the book.
Okay.
And I'm also curious whether or not the book is based on historical events, or if it's...
it is not a fictionalization, if that's your question.
So it was based on real events.
Yeah, it is a history. Okay. So, the full title of the book is Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI. So, a big part of this story is that the investigation of the Osage murders was the kind of initialization of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is the thing that, like, who was it? Hoover, I think, established the FBI, and this was like his big thing to get the Bureau off the ground, and like, we can actually make a difference by sending in government agents to this community that clearly can't police themselves very well. So that's kind of the overarching idea, which you see in the fact that, like you said, the second half of the film turns into a crime procedural when the FBI step in, and then they go through all the investigation. But it's all investigation of stuff that we already know, because our story is following the relationship between Ernest and Molly. So to that point, originally DiCaprio was going to play the Texas Ranger, who is the head of the FBI, who comes in. And eventually they realized, like, I guess, whatever artistic drama, Leonardo DiCaprio struggling to get into character to figure out how it's going to fit in the film, and then he's like, Marty, what is the heart of this movie? And Marty's like, well, I guess it's the relationship between Ernest and Molly. He's like, well, then I should be playing Ernest, basically. And so they swap that around, and so now it's centered on that relationship, but it's still, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. So his is the story that we're following, which gives us a behind the scenes into the mystery and distances us from the Osage people. Which, like you're saying, the Osage are not the protagonists of the film, because technically that's Ernest, but they are still the subject of the film, which makes it a really weird kind of a story, like you're saying.
There's a lot of dissonance created by that decision.
Because it's clearly about the Osage, but we're not, they're like in the background which... Yeah,
they get backgrounded in their own movie. They're like background characters and murder victims in a movie that's ostensibly about them.
Yeah, and I guess the best defense that you could make for that is that there is a large purpose of the film, which is to implicate the audience, right? It's to make us feel like we are part of the oppressors in this situation, which is... also kind of a strange approach. I mean, it's understandable, but it's not the easiest sell, obviously. So that makes a difference. So I understand a lot of your concerns, but does that make sense? Why like it's kind of was originally more about the FBI and about that breaking up of the crime ring, because it essentially is an organized crime story.
Well, the book aspect does make sense. The idea that the reason Ernest is forefronted is because of Leonardo DiCaprio is not surprising. I had a feeling that one of the reasons the focus was there was because that's where the big name star was. But it explains it, but I don't think it justifies it, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. But I definitely see what you're saying in that, like, if we had focused solely on Molly, we could have had a really intense, like, Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion level of suspense. Yeah. Because Suspicion is the one with, like, where she's not sure if Cary Grant is trying to kill her the whole time after they get married. And that would be so good to just draw that out. There's, like, it would be like a mix of... Suspicion and like Night of the Hunter, where it's like, I think that the serial killer is living in my house, and I think he loves me, but I also think that he's trying to kill me, and I don't know how to reconcile all of those emotions at the same time.
And you have all these suspicious behaviors, all these suspicious deaths. You could have learned more about these characters and their deaths. You could have built like this creepy, haunting suspension, and then the big reveal would be that, like, yes, all this is happening, but there's an even more sinister, cynical side to it, which is that it's all part of an organized crime ring. Yeah. On top of that, it's not just
which is within your family.
Killers. It's depraved psycho killers who are killing you over like substantial, like substance, wealth type of reasons, which is even darker in a sense. So I feel like I don't know. I feel like that would have been a really interesting way to structure this. And again, I think like Leonardo DiCaprio and Scorsese just got in their own ways. But it's made, it's done.
Yeah. So let's talk about it as it is. Point taken about how it could have been approached. But let's talk about it as it is, because I think it has a lot of good tragic elements to handle, because really what we're looking at in this type of injustice is the injustice of prejudice, right? So it is the othering of the Osage people and the prejudice that lets the King Hale and the Burkhart family feel entitled to, get whatever they can from those people. And so what Scorsese was really going for, I think, in the way that he did choose to approach this story is this really complicated dynamic between the idea that Ernest truly loves Molly, and King Hale truly likes the Osage people, and yet their desire for those material wealth or rights trumps whatever genuine feeling they have for the people, and it causes a huge human toll. And so, like, King Hale becomes emblematic of just any entity that is willing to just take advantage of any kind of system for personal gain, regardless of what the toll is of that. But it is really complicated because there is a genuine love story and a genuine, this genuine struggle between Ernst's love for his wife and his greed, fueled by King Hale.
I guess that raises a question too. Do you think that Ernest is not a smart man?
No.
So I could see a scenario in which he thinks he loves Molly, but he never seems to really actually. Maybe he thinks he loves her, but doesn't really.
I almost, and maybe this is part of the ambiguity that the film wants to raise, but I could almost see it the other way. Like, I feel like his love for Molly is almost the more true thing, and he is trying to block out the reality of what he's doing on the other side of it from his own mind. Like the fact where he's trying to, because his alleged or suspected poisoning of Molly is the only one that's never like deliberately spoken about, even to Ernest, even though he's already in on all of this stuff. But I think he's still trying to convince himself that killing Molly is not what he's doing, which is why he takes some of the poison, which is why, he like has this confliction between giving it to her. So I feel like he's more committed to Molly, but King Hale's influence is stronger on him in a weird kind of like Emperor Palpatine kind of way. Yeah.
But and then I guess the question then is why? Like, is it just because they're both, once they're married too, like they're both family. So, why in that sense would his family relation to King trump his relation to his wife? So I
think it's because King is more aggressive about it. Like Molly is she will speak her mind, but she ultimately, kind of has a submissive role to her husband where she lets him give her the medicine, even though she basically knows or suspects that it's not good. But King always pushes himself on to Ernest to get him to do whatever he wants, and he convinces him. Molly will speak her mind, and then she'll let Ernest do whatever he's going to do anyway, without pushing the matter, which is just really complicated kind of dynamic.
Yeah, it's a bit interesting too. I think the most interesting moment to me was when Molly asked him if he was scared of King, because I believe he is. Yeah. Whether consciously or not, I think he knows that King is dangerous.
But it's again one of those things where he's trying to, he can't admit it even to himself, even though he knows it. So, yeah, I think in Aristotelian terms, I think I would say Ernest is a bad man, right? He's definitely not a good man. He is either indifferent, leaning towards bad, but Hale is a very bad man. Hale is your very bad man that you don't want anything, good to happen to him. But Ernest has both his vices, but he also has a lot of poor judgment, which is your point, that he's not a very smart man. And I think his biggest element of poor judgment is trusting Hale and continuing to go along with Hale, basically exclusively because of his blood relation, which is that Godfather aspect that Scorsese loves so much.
Yeah. In Scorsese films, typically characters have sealed their fate when the story starts because they're already part of some kind of criminal organization. I don't know. It's an interesting thing here. In a way, his fate is sealed at the beginning because of who he's related to, and in a way, Molly's fate is sealed at the beginning because she's Osage.
Yeah, but again, Molly has kind of that, almost the resignation to it too. Like she's very, you see it a lot throughout the film, how much she kind of bottles up within her. Like she feels a lot, but she doesn't express it all that much to Ernest, because I think she genuinely loves him too. And I think that's a big thing. There was one interview that I watched of Scorsese. It's like a 45-minute interview with Apple Music or whatever that I'll put a link to, but they go into a lot of interesting topics. And he says that the major theme of the film is love as a weapon. And so, because he talks about how when he was talking with a bunch of the Osage people going through the story and stuff, a lot of times they would say things like, don't forget that Ernest really loved Molly. Regardless of everything else he did, he actually loved her. And don't forget King Hale and, or rather, oh gosh, I gotta get the name. Henry Roan. Henry Roan was the Osage that lived with Hale, but he was a drunk, and he was Molly's first husband, ceremonially or whatever. But Henry Roan was King Hale's best friend, and that is true, as well as the fact that King Hale killed Henry Roan to get his life insurance policy. And so it's like this really complicated aspect of the genuine human emotion, but being completely trumped by this insatiable greed, which is what is the kind of preeminent struggle that you're watching throughout the film, as played out by King Hale, who's being very intentional about that, and Ernest, who kind of knows it, but is kind of trying to block it out of his mind the whole time.
Yeah. I don't know. That's an interesting point. There's a shift over the course of the movie in Ernest slowly becoming slightly more suspicious about his godfather's actions, his uncle's actions.
And it's not so much suspicion, because Ernest is part of the operation. He starts off by robbing them. He has to get someone to go out and kill. He has to set up the whole bombing, which kicks off the entire investigation. So he's doing both of them, but he just can't bring himself to see the contradiction in the actions. But also in terms of the love as a weapon thing, the last thing that King Hale says, once Ernest has completely woken himself up to the situation, and he's like, I'm done with you, uncle, in prison, when he goes to testify against him. And the last thing that Hale says is, I love you, son. And that's his last final desperate weapon to try and get Ernest back. Because that's all he knows. That's all he knows is to use his facade of love to get what he needs out of any situation.
So they do quite a bit of love bombing in this. Quite a bit of masquerading. In a way, it's interesting too, because they seem to be doing, at least publicly, they're doing these mental gymnastics to appear as good people, but they're, even though they're very clearly not. And everyone in town too seems to kind of know it, and to some extent, and just kind of have their suspicions about them in general, and look the other way, which I guess is kind of back to that tragedy of the bystander we were talking about with Umberto D. But I guess, Jonathan, the question is, because I know you were talking about bad men, good men, where do you think this falls into that category?
Yeah, and like I was starting to say earlier, I consider Ernest as a bad man, but Hale as a very bad man. Hale is the one that you don't want to go from misery to happiness. You want him to end in misery, but also Hale is clearly not the main character, because if he just goes from happiness to misery, we don't care, because he's really bad. And so that's just kind of what has to happen. Ernest, as a bad man, is mostly, he has vices, but he also has a lot of poor judgment, which is in his trusting of Hale at all times. And so I think he just, it's just poor judgment after poor judgment until the very end when he kind of wakes up to where he should have been putting his allegiances in the first place. But by then it's too late.
Yeah, I think it is important that he kind of meets and falls for Molly a little bit before King gets involved with their relationship, because it does give some sense of deniability.
Yeah.
Not a lot. It's not long after they meet that King is like, oh yeah, she's got prospects and good land. You should hang out with her. So not by a wide margin, but there's something there. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. What do we make of some of the aspects of Ernest's character, such as the idea that he's kind of dumb,
Poor judgment. Yeah.
injured from the war, so he can't do any heavy lifting.
Which is funny because he becomes the grunt man in this assassination ring.
Yeah. And there's an interesting recurring theme in which people complain about other people having money without having worked for it.
Yeah, that's the main complaint against the Osage.
When they are not necessarily working for their money either because they're stealing it.
Yeah, but my thought is if they put half the effort into doing genuine work that they do into murdering Osage, they would probably make a whole lot of money a whole lot faster.
Yeah, they could honestly. There is a very good case to be made for living in prosperity alongside these people, and there seem to have been quite a few people who have moved to Osage County and live there as servants or working class people and seem to be making a good living.
Yeah, like there's all the even the people like at the very beginning when the Osage are in line at the bank or something, and there's like the tintype photographers. Yeah, and they're just like they know that these people have too much money, so they're like, I'm gonna upcharge a bunch of like photos and stuff, which is probably its own form of injustice. And you get that same idea with the bank and stuff where Ernest is like, you're charging me Osage prices, but I'm don't do that to me. I know you. So there's those like little bits of injustice, but still, it's like you could go and and make money alongside these people. Like they want to spend their money, offer them something of value, and let them spend their money.
Cattle ranch, you could be selling meat.
Yeah,
I mean they clearly have money to go around. They need goods. They need everything. So they've got money to spend. There's plenty of money to be made there without having to murder people. That's purely the source of greed and downright evil.
Even beyond that, like Hale already has this murder ring going on to get these head rights, which he's I guess just mostly wanting as like he's old already, but I guess it'll go to his family, and that's what he wants. I don't know exactly what his game plan is, but the other thing is like it's not even about that, because while he's doing that, he's also committing insurance fraud in 100 different ways, like burning up his own land to get like the fire insurance and getting Henry Roan's life insurance. And, he just has to take advantage of systems like compulsively. It's so weird.
Yeah, no, there is something deeply psychologically screwed up that drives people to do this kind of thing. And I mean, there's a reason it's incredibly rare that you see this kind of mass organized ring devoted to murdering people to steal their money. That doesn't happen a lot. It's one of the reasons why it's so significant enough to make like the contents of a book or a movie or a film.
Yeah. Or to the point of the book, like it's why when something like this happens, you can start an entire federal bureau to look into it. Yeah.
Speaking of which, that's an interesting shift in the movie. We go from this kind of like slow, almost creepy pace in Osage County to this like fast-paced, prohibition-esque crime movie in Colorado Springs with fire bombings and bank robberies and stuff. And it's like, oh, Scorsese got distracted again.
Yeah.
Now we're telling a different story. I mean, technically it's part of the same story, but still.
There's definitely that shift from like the community aspect to like, okay, now we've got like a whole government investigation going on and stuff like that. But Alex, I want to bring this in, which is going to start to transition us into overall notes, because this episode is like last episode, Tragedies of Self. All three of those films were completely fictional. Here we have two films which are based on actual historical events, and one film which gives us a very real sense of general historical events. And so it brings up, because we're going to see more historical tragedies next time, but it brings up the line between like art, poetry, and history. Art and poetry being the same thing. So I have a quote from Scorsese that I want to kind of marry with a quote from Aristotle, because they are both going for the same kind of idea. This is also in that Apple Music interview. It's a little bit summarized, but I'll put the entire interview in the description.
With all due respect to your filmography, is this the most important film that you've ever made?
Well, you define the word important.
That there is a historical retelling here that if you don't get the detail and the nuances correct, that it's more than a bad review.
Well, the point is, does art have to be important for the moment? How should I put it? Art should be important all the time. Do you follow?
Yeah.
And then it'll fall out of importance, and then it might come back into importance. I was very cognizant because I understood that there's much more to the story of just one horrific series of events, let's say, in with the Osage Nation, that if I can make that to reflect history, to reflect who we are as human beings, to reflect, basically the European Americans coming in and taking, and they said, well, you can go to the Sumerians and you could see the Assyrians did this and the Elamites did that, and all of that. Well, yeah, and they're still doing it. It's still, because the land is there, and that's what the land has the water, the land has the grazing area, that sort of thing. So, in a way, can this reflect the macrocosm of who we are as human beings in greed? And I think that's where I forced myself to go with the story, and Leo went with me on that.
And so it's this idea of like, we're telling the story of the Osage people, but we're really telling the story, like you were saying, of Dutch syndrome, the syndrome of someone having more than someone else and being taken advantage of from all sides, whether that's kind of historical examples of imperialism or whatever kind of conflict that brings up. It happens over and over and over again. And Aristotle gets to the same point where he says, and again, this is going to transition us into overall notes, but Aristotle says the distinction between the historian and the poet is not in the one writing prose and the other verse. You might put the work of Herodotus into verse and it would still be a species of history. It consists really in this, that one describes the thing that has been, the other a kind of thing that might be. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of graver importance than history, since its statements are of the nature, rather, of universals, whereas those of history are singulars. By a universal statement, I mean one as to what such and such a kind of man will probably or necessarily stay or do, which is the aim of poetry. So, the idea being, you can write a history of the Osage, but if you want it to be art, if you want it to be poetry, you have to say that this is what this kind of person will do in this kind of situation. And I think Scorsese was going for that, and we can debate whether or not he achieved it, but I think overall, when we're talking about tragedy stories, like same thing with Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a story of what happened to the Joan of Arc of France of 1430 whatever, but it's also the story. But it's also the story of anyone who's been unjustly accused by a power system that's outside of their control. It is how someone of her status of nobility will act in that situation, and so that elevates the story of Joan of Arc out of just being an interesting historical document into being something of perennial value again.
I see what you're saying. I don't know. I think to some extent that's true. But I think to another certain extent, perhaps it builds too hard of a description for what a good artistic film must be. Some aspect of it should be universal, but to say that this is how somebody in this situation should always act might be too prescriptive, or too distant from letting certain specific, unique, interesting characters exist. So I don't know. I think there's aspects of that that's true, but it's hard to say it's universal.
So yeah, I wouldn't say, and I don't think Aristotle is saying like, this is how someone should act in this situation. It's saying this is how this kind of person will act in this situation. It's more like an observation than a prescription. Does that make sense?
Yes. All right, so in that case, it's more in line with the idea of a character being a character having certain ways that they act, and that if they act against those ways, they cease to be that character.
So a lot of what Aristotle is talking about is poetry is this, it is a retelling of histories in the way that the Greeks understood it. So those mythologies were retellings of histories, and oftentimes he talks about how like most of their stories at that period were coming from a few lines of like Greek houses. So you have like the story of Odysseus was told a lot of different times, but and the stories of like Oedipus and like all these different the kings or these family lines, they were told in different ways. But the idea is that if you can take the story of Odysseus and put it in a way that applies to more than just Odysseus, it applies to someone like Odysseus in that situation, here's what might happen, or here's what could happen based on the character of that person. That's what kind of elevates it out of just like, this is what Odysseus did, into this is what someone like Odysseus would probably do in this kind of situation.
I think it comes back close to that idea you were talking about of fear being part of tragedy, and that for a tragedy to really be impactful on screen, there must be some element of it that could potentially connect to your own life. Something that connects you, like, oh, maybe not to this extent. Obviously, like, it'd be very hard to connect too specifically to the story of Joan of Arc, unless you have something's really gone crazy in your life, which I don't know, maybe it has.
So like another film that we talked about, okay, let's try and approach it this way. So another film that we talked about on the podcast, or actually I think it was on the bonus podcast, but we went and saw it in theaters together, is A Hidden Life. And it's a very different situation, but imagine that A Hidden Life is a story about a conscientious objector in World War II who did not want to join the Nazi army, and was interrogated for a long time and eventually executed for treason or something like that. So imagine like that guy had watched The Passion of Joan of Arc, and then he finds himself in this situation where suddenly he's being called to do something that he just will not do. And there's kind of like a model of what someone has done in that kind of situation. And so he's, on some kind of subconscious level, got to say, am I going to be that kind of a person in this situation? And even though I know Joan of Arc was executed, even though she was innocent, even though she was being unjustly accused. And so it like we've talked about a lot before too, stories are a form of pattern recognition. So it's laying out patterns of things that have been in order to lay out patterns of the ways that things may or will be in the future.
Oh, that's relevant then in the sense that all of our three films have very specific historical contexts.
Right.
I guess the only one that doesn't technically portray a specific person as Umberto D, but even that's based on De Sica's father and from a very specific point in Italian history. So,
and like we said, it could apply to 100 Italians in different ways from the same time period.
yes.
So, and yeah, I think that even applies to our tragedies of self, which again, were all fictional, but it still is based on the storytellers, the poets' experience of how people act, and it's creating a model based on kind of combining a bunch of patterns of behavior that are somewhat based in history, based on whoever the poet knew, and then how it could play out in a specific situation. So the other thing that I want to bring up is, like, because injustice is fairly intangible, even when it does have tangible agents like a King Hale or a bishop of whatever, they're not things that go away when you defeat that agent. So if you like, King Hale gets put away in jail after like the first killing, that doesn't mean that prejudice is gone. That doesn't mean that Dutch syndrome is gone. It's going to come up in other ways. Same thing with marginalization or power. And so what we're watching is like the struggle of the protagonist or the subject of the film, in the case of like Killers of the Flower Noon, the struggle against these things that are kind of overarching. And the Greek word agon is the Greek word for conflict or struggle or contest. So it's like, would be, the Olympics just happened, and it's like the agon is like an Olympic term of feats of strength, but specifically of two people against each other. But it becomes the root word for words like agony and also protagonist and antagonist. And so when we're talking about stories, we're talking about people who are in a struggle in some form or other. And here we're looking at people in a struggle against these kind of overarching powers or systems or human vices that come out in different ways. And we have to be able to see that agon, that struggle, beyond just the characters in the stories. So again, the agon is what we're watching. The agon is the struggle, which is brought out by the plot, which is the events of things that happen. And those events, an order of events of things that happen, can be kind of extracted from the specific story and the specific characters and applied to life in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of glossary for it. But yeah, I think it's all very relevant to what we were talking about today, specifically with these films, especially.
And we're going to see, so the rest of the episodes in this series are going to be, again, seeing that struggle, but what are we struggling against? What are the protagonists in that struggle against? And however intangible injustice seems, it is not nearly so intangible as what we're talking about next time. Alex, what are we talking about next time?
Well, next time we're talking about the tragedies of fate, things beyond human control, or at least beyond the control of the characters in them. Almost like Umberto D, but without as many specifics to the system. Things that just cannot be avoided, no matter how hard you try. So we're going to talk about three, well, I mean, I'm going to say it this way. 2 very sad films and then 1 very weepy film.
One very what?
Weepy film? I don't know. A little sappy. I'm not a big Titanic fan, so we'll talk about it. But anyway, we're going to be talking about Ikiru from 1952 by Akira Kurosawa, a fantastic tragedy film. And then we're going to talk about Grave of Fireflies from 1988 from Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. And then we're going to be talking about Titanic from 1997, which has Leonardo DiCaprio in it as well, who I promise I like as an actor. It just so happens that we're going to be covering 2 DiCaprio films back to back that I don't particularly like, but are very relevant to the matter at hand.
Yeah. And so the tragedies of fate, we'll talk about it next time, but like, in terms of where these fit, I'm Fate is kind of an encompassing term that includes, like, you know, you could call it tragedies of providence, tragedies of fate, tragedies of accident or chance. And I think all three of these films kind of fit into that category. But it's, yes, stuff that's completely out of your control and kind of out of everyone's control. And there's not like if only someone had done this. It's just, this is how life goes sometimes.
Yeah, you almost always know how it's going to end when it starts.
Yeah. So,
and then it's almost always watching people go through the 5 stages of grief on screen.
But it's something that happens all the time. And so we need those models.
Paint me like one of your French films.
Okay, before Alex makes too many Titanic jokes, we'll save them for next episode.
Oh, don't worry. The jokes will go on. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 501 films we have covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
501. Suck on that, Dalmatians. You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
Summaries for this episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Yeah, I don't know. A lot of this. Jonathan,
Yes?
are you recording backup audio?
Oh, no. Yes, I am.
Okay, good. My Audacity has stopped working partway through.
Do you have any of it?
Yes, I have an hour and 23 minutes of it.
Okay.
Where are we currently at in terms of recording?
I've been recording for an hour and 38 minutes, but I started recording a little bit early.
Okay.
So
that's
there's
not
a
too bad.
small gap. Yeah. You got too many tabs open?
Something like that. Let me just check one more thing, make sure this is good to open up again. All right, now we got some space. We'll go back to here. Let me save this. Give it a few seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I think something updated in the background and nuked. One of my games updated in the background and nuked my storage space. So I just deleted it, uninstalled, and now we've got room. Which is crazy because normally these files do not take up a lot of space.
Yeah.
Alrighty. We should be good to go right from there if I know my Audacity well enough.
And yes, we are good to pick up right from there. All right, recording, ready for new clap? Clap received.